very good evening to you all, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. I hope you can all hear me and see me okay, as well as the slides which we've been sharing. My name is Janie, and I'm the Executive Director of ECCR, the hosts of the event this evening, which is part of our Restoring Hope series of online events that we've been running this week. I'm delighted that you've been able to join us tonight, and we're expecting a good number of participants, with about 200 signing up to hear more about this very important topic. So a very warm welcome. Before I introduce the rest of the panel to you, just a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. We will make sure that there is plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the session, but as this is a webinar format and all the attendees are muted, please do submit your questions via the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. You're welcome to submit questions throughout the session. However, these will only be answered during the Q&A session at the end. You're able to vote for the questions you like the most by liking them with the little thumbs up symbol if there's a question that you like and you particularly want addressed. Please note that the Q&A box is different to the chat box. At the different points throughout the session, we will make use of the chat box to share links and information, but we will let you know when we do so. If you are experiencing technical difficulties, you can message the panelists via the chat box, and we'll do our best to help. At certain points, we might share presentation slides, and when we do, the video images of the presenters will be small boxes somewhere on your screen, usually on the right-hand side. If these get in your way at all of being able to see the screen, you're able to move the box with the speakers around the screen by dragging them to a different place should you wish to. Now, to get us used to the technology, we're going to start with a Zoom poll. We have one now and one later in the evening. It's worth noting that all answers to the Zoom polls are anonymous, so please answer honestly. Now, the first one is coming up on your screen now. And there's a question for you. On a scale of 1 to 10, to what extent do you feel you know how to connect the Christian faith to issues of faith, finance, and consumerism? 1 being I understand very little, and 10 being I could talk about this at length. So I'm just going to give you all a few moments to vote. Last few votes coming in now. Fantastic. Okay, so that's the majority voted. So a bit of a cross section there. That's really helpful. Majority somewhere in the middle. So that just helps us to give a bit of a snapshot and understand our audience here this evening. So thanks for bearing with us for the Zoom housekeeping and for answering the poll. And I think we're ready to begin. So some of you may know about the work of ECCR, but for those of you who don't, a very brief introduction. ECCR stands for the Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility. We were established about 30 years ago and have brought churches, faith groups, and religious orders together on campaigns and advocacy around how businesses behave in the world. Our vision is to see money used in a way that creates a fairer and more sustainable world. We do this primarily through 2 programs, our Money Makes Change program and Church Action for Tax Justice. So Money Makes Change is a program and set of resources to help Christians explore and make ethical choices around money. We want to open up conversations around how we spend, save, and invest, and inspire action to create a fairer world through our finances. While individually we may have little, we still have the power to make positive things happen with our money. When we act together, our power increases dramatically. Imagine what a difference we could make if every Christian chose to bank with an ethical bank and invested their pension and savings in companies working to better our planet. Church Action for Tax Justice is a program that seeks to raise awareness in churches of the importance of tax justice, to campaign for a fairer, greener tax system, and to encourage Christians and all faith organizations to promote tax justice through their work. We focus on campaigning, advocacy, and education, and want to see a tax system that serves the common good. More specifically, we seek an end to tax dodging and the implementation of tax policies which address poverty and inequality. Later on this evening, you will hear from two of our team members who are responsible for leading these two programs, Rosie Venner, who runs Money Makes Change, and Dr. Justin Thacker, who runs Church Action for Tax Justice. They will be responding to our main speakers this evening, Dr. Ruth Valerio and Dr. Rowan Williams, and sharing their thoughts following their talks. The COVID-19 crisis has created a deficit of hope as people worry about their health, jobs, and finance. As a team at ECCR, we were inspired to put on a series of online events over the week called Restoring Hope, exploring the relevance of the Christian faith to our financial decisions and the wider economy, and in the process, helping us to rediscover hope in these challenging times. Just to say that tonight is also being put on in collaboration with JustShare. JustShare is a coalition of churches, charities, and other organizations committed to equal global development and social justice. They seek to drive discussion and promote change, promoting a just share of the world's resources for everyone, and thanks to them for their input too. Now, I am delighted that we've been joined tonight by two speakers who will share their thoughts on faith and finance, Dr. Ruth Valerio and Dr. Rowan Williams. Each will speak for approximately 20 minutes, and then this will be followed by a reflection by Rosie or Justin, before we move to a time of questions at the end. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Rowan Williams. Dr. Williams is the Chancellor of the University of South Wales, Honorary Professor of Contemporary Christian Thought at the University of Cambridge, and of course, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. In his 30s, he was arrested and fined for singing psalms at an airbase, and he has written widely on literature and theology. His most recent work being The Way of St. Benedict, a reflection and application of the 6th century monk to contemporary life. Rowan, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jenny. And I'm delighted to be able to take part in this event and to help open a discussion of a matter which very often doesn't come right to the forefront of the minds of quite a lot of Christians. What I'm going to do is to say a few words in general about taxation and its place in a just society, and then try and think with you a little bit about where our heritage of understanding the Bible comes in to enrich this and focus it for us. Now, those of you who look quite often at job advertisements and mission statements and things like that will know that there's now quite a list of words which any self-respecting person needs to have in that context. You can play a kind of bingo with it, really. Adjectives like robust and accountable, and of course, sustainable. These wonderful words, which we have to slip into pretty well everything, tell us quite a lot about our priorities. But it's that word sustainable, which we've already heard tonight, that I want to begin by highlighting. Sustainability is a bit of a mantra these days, and for all kinds of very good reasons. We're increasingly aware of the risks we run because of compulsive short-term thinking. Sorry, somebody's asked me to be louder. I can't do much with my machine, but I'll try to speak a bit more loudly and hope that I might be a little bit more audible if I sit closer. So may I just check if people can hear what I'm saying now? If anybody still has problems. That's better, says somebody. Good. Well, I'll try and keep that up. Thank you for letting me know about that. Okay, so just to recap, I want to talk about the meaning of the word sustainable and the idea of sustainability, which, as I said, is something which is everywhere these days in our reflection for very good reasons, because we're very conscious of the risks of short-term thinking. We could apply questions about sustainability to our economic life in all kinds of respects, but I want to begin this evening with one particular application of it in the context of taxation. It ought to be clear to all of us that an equitable and transparent taxation system is part of the way we shape a sustainable social life. That's to say, it's part of how we create a kind of steady and dependable background in what is often a very uncertain, rapidly changing environment. A proper taxation policy will ensure that what you might call local successes, whether they're individual or corporate, and social needs are kept in step. We all know that the problem often is that local profit simply runs away into another universe from the realities of social need. Taxation is an attempt to keep those two yoked together so that it's a way of saying that local, particular successes, profits, and wealth need to be somehow connected with the facts of real ongoing need. Because unless there is that steady and dependable background, we are very vulnerable to crisis, accident, unexpected futures, unpredicted fluctuation. And everyone's advantage in the long term is served by having that dependable, steady background. It means that there are always resources for the structural support of people who are losing out, for emergency response, but also for continuing investment in the common good. And that perhaps is one of the formulae we might keep in mind. Taxation is investment for the common good, creating that steady and dependable environment, which is in the long run in everyone's interest, and which allows wealth and need to be kept connected. Now, just at the moment, as this country and many other countries face an unprecedented crisis, we're perhaps more aware than ever of just how much we need investment in the common good, and in many respects, just how much we have been lacking it. And the uncomfortable truth is that this is not going to get any easier in the foreseeable future. Large-scale public challenges, whether they have to do with public health or with environmental health, are not going away, and they don't observe tidy national and regional boundaries either. Another of the lessons that the present crisis ought to be teaching us, and I hope we are learning from it. But that's just by way of introduction to remind us that we need to keep the question of sustainability in this context of taxation itself connected up with the wider meanings of that word. We need to join it up to issues of environmental stability and climate justice. And if I may be allowed a little bit of a commercial for an organization I'm involved in, Christian Aid, one of our great priorities in recent years has been to try to keep issues around tax justice and issues around climate justice closely together in our advocacy and our campaigning. So I mentioned that as you might say, the larger context in which a lot of this discussion takes place. So that's really by way of introduction. Sustainability in tax policy is a way of creating a background of steadiness and dependability in society, a way of investing in the common good, that is, securing some kinds of benefit that are intrinsically, necessarily shared in a society. In other words, if somebody hasn't got them, something goes wrong for everyone. And that's one of the messages that I think a Christian social philosophy always ought to be pressing. If something goes wrong for somebody, something goes wrong for everybody. Now, that begins to underline a point which I think is of great importance for Christians reflecting on this matter. A Christian approach to finance has to say more than just it's a good Christian thing to be nice to the poor. If that's all we have to say, that rather takes for granted that there is an ongoing dichotomy between people who have wealth and people who don't, that the ones who don't are essentially passive and the ones who do have it are under an obligation to share it. Well and good, but it's a tiny sliver of the truth. As I think that the specifically Christian element in thinking about finance is not so much that it's good to be good to the poor, but it's the vision of a human community in which everyone can be equipped to contribute in building a social project. Everyone in Christian belief has in them the divine image, and the divine image is a capacity for creative responsibility, making a difference. Our creativity is visible in our relationships in all sorts of ways. It's visible in imagination and art, but it's also visible in society building. And we forget that at our peril. The creative gift, which is God's image in us, is a political matter, as well as a matter of ethics and the arts. We build together, we work together in a social project. And if people are to work together, they must have the capacity and the confidence to bring what they have and who they are into that shared work. So my argument really is that a fully Christian account of and approach to finance in society, not least taxation, has to be set in that context, against that background, of a vision of a collaborative, cooperative society, where people are released to give what they're able to give. And as you see, that's something which rather undercuts the idea that there are active people and passive people, active rich people and passive poor people, givers and receivers. If you look at what St. Paul has to say about the Christian society in his letters, you'll see that that is the very opposite of what he has in mind. He's thinking of a community in which everyone is a giver and everyone is a receiver. And that, I think, is important to underline, because one of the things that is quite often said by certain kinds of usually more conservative commentator is that a progressive and redistributive taxation system removes personal responsibility. It hands over to the state the responsibility to equalize, incentivize, build capacity. And I think actually the opposite, complete opposite, is true. It's a bit of a paradox, but it's worth pausing on. Tax justice, equitable, transparent, sustainable taxation system is a matter of giving power and responsibility, not taking it away. It gives power and responsibility because it guarantees that no one is unable to contribute socially because of their disadvantage. And I think that's one of the points which we ought, as Christians, to be making very forcefully in public discussion. A good taxation system is not handing over to some impersonal and distant authority a responsibility which really belongs to us. A good taxation system is allowing us to become more responsible together. And the key word there is together. A good taxation system creates what we rather conspicuously lack at the moment, and that's a society where people feel that they can actually trust the social environment they're in. They feel able to invest in building that social environment, making it more rich, more constructive, and more just, because they know that society at large is investing in them. Remember what I said earlier, that a fair taxation system is a form of investing in the common good. So all of that takes me back to the word sustainability. The idea of a system and a policy that can keep some things relatively steady in an uncertain and fast-changing context. It also, I hope, helps us to see why a society's levels of progressive and redistributive taxation should be a matter of pride and not anxiety. We ought to be in a position where we can say it is a mark of our maturity and our intelligence, our shared intelligence as a society, that we have a taxation system which genuinely seeks to address disadvantage, which genuinely seeks to connect profit here and need there. It's, of course, a rather counterintuitive thing in many contexts to talk about taxation in those terms. Taxation is, for most people, not just the super wealthy, most people, something which you want to try and wriggle around as much as you can. And I would venture to say that probably most of us at some level wouldn't object to paying less tax if we didn't think about it. But the fact is that a society that makes creative demands on us in this way is a society we ought to be proud of. Now, I'm not, frankly, holding my breath and expecting that that big change in attitude and assumption is going to happen overnight. But what if we, as Christian believers, were to be more forthright about saying that the pattern of social relationship we believe to be central and in accordance with God's will, that pattern is best served by investment in the common good. We can't expect the whole of our society to behave as if it were simply the body of Christ in St. Paul's terms. We can, though, say that we have, as Christian believers, a model of human relationship, which, because it takes everyone with total seriousness as a potential contributor to social construction, does more for human dignity and human liberty than other kinds of models. Now, before I finish, just a couple of caveats. A fairly obvious one, which is taxation alone, of course, is not the answer. Of course, there is a role for the creation of wealth. People act because that's what they like to see emerging. But we need to ask about what prosperity, wealth, really is for, whether as individuals or as a society. The work done in the University of Surrey by Professor Tim Jackson and his Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity has been working for several years on trying to refine and sharpen this idea of what really counts as prosperity, what wealth is actually for. On the assumption that if we can't answer those questions, we're locked into an endless and finally meaningless spiral of acquisition and exploitation, which in fact undermines the very basis of social life and finally the very basis of our life on this planet, as we're seeing with uncomfortable clarity at the moment in a situation of environmental risk and degradation. So it's not that taxation policy is the panacea here. Wealth does and should create markets. Markets spread prosperity. Voluntary mutual organization, individual initiative, all play a part. But the important thing is to identify what can't be done without a sound basis for our thinking about taxation, a sound basis for understanding what it is that can only be done as a shared project, a shared investment. Public goods of a certain kind, and the ability to rely on a basically steady backdrop to financial activity so that we minimize risk for society. That is the crucial role that a full-blooded system of sustainable taxation should have. That's why the realities of tax evasion in many countries across the world is something that cripples investment in public infrastructure, education, and the like. We see that in many contexts, and we know that that can't be how it ought to work. So as I say, it's not simply about taxation solving everything, it's about understanding what a public tax policy is needed for. Behind all this is the Judeo-Christian and Islamic conviction that wealth is given in order to be put to work, just as all divine gifts are ultimately given to be shared. And so if we're trying to shape a coherent and consistent Christian response, I can't speak, of course, for Jews and Muslims here, but a consistent Christian response to issues about the question of why we ought to be concerned about transparency and equity in taxation policy here and across the world. These are some of the principles I think we ought to be beginning with at the most broad and, I grant you, abstract level. But I hope that in the rest of the discussion this evening, we'll actually bring those to more specific questions, more specific problems we need to resolve. But thank you very much for listening so far.
Thanks very much, Rowan. I found that fascinating, and I look forward to hearing more from you during our Q&A session later. I'm now going to pass over to Dr. Justin Thacker, who leads our Church Action for Tax Justice programme, to respond. Just a reminder that we will be taking questions and answers later on. So there are some raised hands, but we'll be doing that a bit later. If you do have questions, if you can put them into the Q&A box rather than the chat box, that would be great, because the chat box can't be seen by everybody else on the call, it can only be seen by the panelists. So if you do have questions, pop them in there. So I will pass over now to Justin. Justin, over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Rowan, for what, as ever, has been a sumptuous feast for us to digest. Now, in a moment, I'm going to come to some reflections on what you've shared, but let me begin with just some preliminary comments. The title we chose for this week of events was Restoring Hope. It might seem an odd one, not because there's no need to encourage hope at this time, there obviously is that need, but because of our subtitle, a series of events exploring faith and finance. While it's easy to think of hope in the context of faith, the presence of hope in relation to finance is perhaps a bit more elusive. But I think it's precisely in this area that seeds of hope can be found, and that is what I'd like to reflect upon. In his most recent encyclical, Pope Francis takes to task the culture of individualism that's destroying societies. He writes, quote, "We are more alone than ever. In a world that promotes individual interests and weakens the communitarian dimension of life, the advance of this kind of globalism strengthens the more powerful who can protect themselves, but it tends to diminish the weaker and poorer." And he goes on to call that individualism virus that makes us believe everything consists in giving free rein to our own ambitions. In light of this, I love that idea you shared, Rowan, that tax justice is fundamentally about a gift. Because for a certain breed of economists, the only way in which to frame taxation is that of taking, especially the government taking our hard-earned cash. But as you've suggested, well, tax justice might mean a loss of financial wealth for some. It also leads to a growth in social wealth for all of us. It also, incidentally, leads to a much fairer financial settlement, especially for those who are poorer. But what I want to focus on it's not that aspect, but the way in which tax justice represents a net gain, a gift, as you put it, for society as a whole, as trust amongst other social goods is increased. Now, let me give you an example that illustrates this. Until a few years ago, HMRC had just one purpose. That was to maximize revenue for the government. And despite the fact that it's the nation's collector of taxes, its sole purpose was not to ensure that everyone paid the right taxes at the right time in the right way. Its overriding purpose was to ensure that they obtained as much revenue as they could, which of course meant that if an individual corporation had been avoiding their taxes, it wasn't HMRC's role necessarily to ensure a fair and just settlement. It was primarily their role to get as much from the person or corporation as they could. Now, to be fair to them, this has changed more recently, at least in theory. However, many tax campaigners are of the view that the mentality that prioritizes revenue collection above all other purposes still prevails and continues to be seen in the way that some cases of avoidance are prosecuted. But such an approach is to prioritize one outcome, economic gain, at the expense of all others, including especially social goods, such as trust in government, trust in one another, social cohesion. So in calculating the benefit of tax justice, the bottom line is not just an economic one, but also social. We, it seems to me, have forgotten this in our emphasis on the individual. In this way, a fair tax system actually reflects something profound about the very essence of our humanity. For tax is, by its very nature, a communal enterprise. We don't pay taxes in an individual transactional way. My children don't pitch up at school each morning with a pocket full of cash to pay the teachers who teach them. No, the very nature of taxation, as you've suggested, Rowan, is it's a contribution to a communal pot, which helps support communal services, whether that's healthcare, education, or refuse collection. It's an expression in this way of our shared needs and, in fact, shared humanity. Indeed, it can be seen as an expression, I think, of our universal humanity. For at its best, taxes help support not just the services we collectively enjoy today, but also those to be enjoyed by future generations, those not yet born. Which is why, when taxes are reduced to an individualistic transactional consideration in which the only thing that matters is how I reduce my personal liability, one is not just actually acting selfishly and possibly illegally, but one is in effect denying something important about your own identity as a human being in community. And it's in that rejection of individualism and embrace of community that I think we can find hope, perhaps especially in the present crisis. For while COVID has revealed unprecedented levels of inequality, it has at the same time brought out unprecedented levels of neighbourly support. We are discovering once again that social capital is more important than economic. And this is, of course, a rediscovery. For the Christian faith, as well as other faith traditions, have always suggested this, have always indicated that what it means to be human is to be a person in relation, not a person in isolation. And in that remembrance of a different way of being human, I find seeds of hope. For my Christian faith teaches me that who I am is not defined by my individual level of autonomy, status, or wealth, but rather by the quality and depth of my relationships. This is a framework in which I understand myself by means of my impact on others, their impact on me, by my contribution to the common good. Speaking as a Christian theologian, it's a framework that is rooted in a Trinitarian idea of God, where personhood is derived from relationship rather than found in advance of it. It's a framework that takes seriously Jesus's redefinition of the neighbor, not as the one like me or the one I like, but the one who is different to me, who I might even dislike, but who shares my common humanity. So I completely agree with those who say we need to build back better, but in doing so, I actually think we need to have a wholesale rediscovery of what it means to be human. And I think faith traditions can give us that vision. And that is why I have hope. For in speaking of that renewed concept of humanity, we're not inventing something novel or coming up with a brand new plan. We are simply reminding ourselves who we always were. We are in effect coming home. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Justin. I'm now going to pass over to our next speaker, Dr. Ruth Valerio. So Ruth Valerio is the Global Advocacy and Influencing Director for the Christian development charity Tearfund. She was previously the Churches and Theology Director for A Rocha UK and was part of the team that initiated EcoChurch. Her doctorate explored the relationship of simple living to consumerism, and she lives in a social housing estate where, together with other residents, she seeks to put into practice what she believes. Her most recent book was the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book for 2020, Saying Yes to Life. So Ruth, over to you.
Thank you and good evening. It's really lovely to be here in a manner of speaking and to be joining with you. I feel very privileged to be part of this conversation, so thank you very much. I did just want to start by commenting on the little poll that we did at the beginning that put at two separate ends of the spectrum. One, I understand very little, and at the other end was I could talk about this at length. And if only those two were as different as we might think. So I hope maybe I might be a little somewhere in the middle between those two things. I want to start actually by reading out to you a few verses from Isaiah 32. These are verses 15 to 18. And they talk about the vision of, they look forward to the hope for when the Spirit is poured on us from on high. The desert becomes a fertile field, and the fertile field seems like a forest. The Lord's justice will dwell in the desert, his righteousness live in the fertile field. The fruit of that righteousness will be peace. Its effect will be quietness and confidence forever. My people will live in peaceful dwelling places, in secure homes, in undisturbed places of rest. And it strikes me that as we think about this idea of faith and finance in an age of crisis, that this verse speaks right to the vision of the kind of society that we want to be playing a part in working towards, the kingdom of God. And as we think about faith and finance, I want us to locate it within that vision of peace, of shalom, that the prophet paints for us here, and that we see in other places throughout the biblical narrative as well. And what this vision gives us is a picture of the interconnectedness of all things. Justin earlier was talking about how we were created for relationship, and that is at the heart of who we are and the heart of our vision and the heart of the kingdom of God. There is this interconnectedness of all things in relationship. And the Bible is clear that God, the people, and the natural world are deeply interconnected. There's like a triangle that we see all the way through the scriptures of God, the people, and the natural world. Sometimes we think of the Bible as a book that speaks primarily about people. And actually, if we read it as only about people, then we miss the largeness and the scope of what we have there in the scriptural narrative. And so these three aspects are very closely interrelated. And if one aspect of those relationships is broken, then everything else will be impacted. We see that in passages like Jeremiah 12 and Hosea 4, other places, particularly through the Old Testament, that show that when our relationship with God is broken, that demonstrates itself in a lack of care for other people, a lack of compassion, a lack of seeking after justice and working to see people lifted up out of poverty. And when we don't have those things, then we see environmental degradation, to use our modern language. In the biblical terms, we see the land mourning, M-O-U-R-N, the land mourning. There is upheaval in the land because of the sins of the people. So we see that lack of connectedness and what happens when one aspect, any aspect of those relationships is broken there in the Bible. And we're seeing it currently today in this crisis, in this age of crisis that we are in. And the pandemic has exposed a number of serious issues that were there before, but that are now brought right up in front of our faces. The pandemic has exposed pre-existing social inequalities. It's exposed existing social inequalities in the UK. We're seeing it now, such a divide between North and South, such a divide between our experiences currently, depending on where we live. And we know that this pandemic may have been impacting all of us, but it has been impacting us in different ways, depending on our social economic places in this society. And we have seen that that has often intersected with issues around race and racial injustice as well. So we see global inequality, social inequality in the UK, and it has exposed the global inequalities that we already knew existed. And there is a vast difference between how we are experiencing the pandemic here in the UK, wherever we live, and how it's being experienced in other countries that don't have the kind of social security nets, the safety that we are being given, as much as we might argue over how much provision we are being allowed and so on. And many of the countries that Tearfund works in, and I know for Rowan it will be the same with Christian Aid, we're working right into the poorest communities that depend on day labourers. And if they are in lockdown for one day, they will not have the finances in order to buy food the next day. So we know we're living in times of deep social inequality. And as we look at questions around faith and finance, we need to be thinking around how we tackle those. And the pandemic has also exposed our broken relationship with the wider natural world. And we know that COVID-19 is not a natural disaster. It is a disaster of our own making. And if there is one thing for us to learn from this, it is that when we don't take care of the natural world, then we see collapse on an order that has been predicted for many years, but many of us in our individual lives may not have seen coming. And so we know that this pandemic has come about because of our broken relationship with the wider natural world. And this is an opportunity for us to stop and to take stock of how we are taking care of the wider creation. And we have learnt, as we think about faith and finance, we have learnt that the economy does not sit separately above everything else, but the economy sits within ecology. And for too long, we have treated the economy as something that is separate, and ecology and issues of social justice sit somewhere else. And we have thought that as people and as the wider world, we are here to serve the economy. But now we see that where there is environmental breakdown, we see economic collapse as well. And so maybe for the first time, we are really realizing how these things are connected. But we do have an opportunity to change. I believe that this time gives us a crisis that we can turn into a time of kairos, if we are prepared to look at the hard questions that it's giving to us. At Tearfund, we've been talking about this idea of the world rebooted. Now is the time to reboot our world. And as the government is working on economic stimulus packages, now is the opportunity for those packages to put us onto a different track of a system and an economy that is sustainable and socially just. I may later put in the link something to the World Rebooted, so you can have a look at some more of the material around that. The focus for that is on our government and calling our government to put in place this economic stimulus package. And along with Christian Aid and many other organisations, we're joining together with the Climate Coalition to call on the government to be doing this. So we're focusing on change at a governmental level. But this evening, I also want us to think about the change in our own lives too. How do we approach our own finances as people of faith in this time of crisis? Now, I'm very aware that there are all sorts of people on this call, and I don't know your economic situation. I don't know what you are currently facing. And all of these issues will look so different to us, depending on our different situations, our different social locations. But still, I want to talk about 3 principles for us to contemplate and reflect on as we consider how do we approach our own finances as people of faith in this time of crisis. The first principle is contentment. Hebrews 13 verse 5 is a verse I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. Keep yourselves free from the love of money and be content with what you have. And we are caught up in an economic system that is based on discontent and that teaches us to want more and to want more and to want more. And I believe that now, particularly, but at all times, we are called to be content. And that is based on gratitude. I think for many of us, gratitude has become an important feature for us. I've been interested actually as I've read secular articles around well-being and how to keep your levels of mental health good and stable during these troubled times. A lot of them talk about gratitude and learning to focus on the things that are good in the midst of the things that we can't control and that are troubling us economically. Gratitude. And I want to encourage us all the time to be thinking, what are those things that we are grateful for? I've spent time in silence every morning, and that time actually is based on me saying thank you to God. Every time I feel my mind beginning to wander, I bring myself back by saying thank you. Every night when I go to bed and my head touches the pillow, first thing I say is thank you, God. Thank you for this day. Thank you for what you have given me. And it's out of gratitude that we learn contentment, not always to be searching after more things, but to be learning to be content. And I think we've discovered some of that, particularly in those earlier periods of lockdown when the shops were shut and the restaurants were closed. We couldn't go to the cinema. And what could we do? We could go outside for walks. We could go for cycle rides. We could play games at home. We could do fun things on Skype. We learned what we were grateful for and the things that really counted in our lives. Secondly, simplicity. Simplicity, simple living, is around restraint and modesty in our spending habits. And actually it's built on that first foundation of contentment. If we are content with what we've got, then we won't always be wanting to buy more and to fill our lives with things. Simplicity for me is about getting rid of the clutter that stands in the way of our relationships, so that we can hear the voice of God more clearly and serve him more readily. It's about putting the focus on developing our relationships rather than acquiring more things. And as we do that, we discover what it really means to be rich. For simplicity isn't about meanness and poverty, but it's about true abundance and having life to the full in Christ. So simplicity turns our attention away from accumulating more possessions so that we can focus on our relationships. And then finally, as we build on the foundations of contentment, practice a life of simplicity, then thirdly, we can practice generosity. I think generosity is a really important call for us as we consider our finances, the link between our finances and our faith in this age of crisis. Because everything, all the tendencies when we're faced with crisis is to turn in and to protect ourselves and to make sure that we are safe and we are secure before anything else. And so instead, we are called to be generous. We're called to be generous in how we live. I sometimes think that just putting the bird food out and remembering to do that is being generous to the birds that share my garden with me, living in a way that reduces my emissions, not buying unsustainable wood. All of this is a part of living a generous life towards others and towards the whole community of creation. Generosity in how we give. How much do we give? Do we just give of the excess that we've got? Or do we challenge ourselves to be more generous in how much we give and to be considering carefully where it goes to? And then generosity in where we put the money that we keep. And Janie has already mentioned that, thinking around issues of ethical finances and ethical investments, making sure that our pensions are ethical, that our banking and any savings or investments that we might have are being used to bless and to serve and to help others. So contentment, simplicity and generosity are three principles for us as we think about connecting faith and finance. And I just want to conclude with Proverbs 30, 7-9, a well-known verse. I'm sure you've heard of that prayer, give me neither poverty nor riches. And I think as we reflect on this topic of faith and finances, we negotiate a tension and a middle ground in how we approach money, recognizing the very negative aspects of money, that it can distract us, it can cause us to be greedy. Jesus is very clear about the pitfalls of money, and he has a lot of strong words to say about money. Money needs to be handled with care. And yet that doesn't lead us to reject it entirely. Money can be a reflection of a good creator, a generous God. And so we don't reject money entirely. Instead, we look at how we can joyfully approach the material world that we live in and use the good things that we have to bless others. And as we live in this way, we reflect a good God who is himself relationship, who is Trinity, who is generous and bountiful in his blessings and in his creation, and yet was willing to limit himself for the sake of others.
Thanks so much, Ruth. Wow, lots of food for thought there. Really enjoyed your 3 principles of finance. So thank you so much for sharing, and look forward to unpacking more of those thoughts in the Q&A session later. We're now going to pass over to Rosie, who's going to respond to Ruth's thoughts now.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth, for all that you have shared with us and for all that you do in your work and through your writing to stir us up and to challenge us and inspire us. You point towards a radical shift that is needed, I think a transformation of how we view the world, how we steward resources, how we take care of all of God's creation, and the need to model a very different way of living through those 3 principles of contentment, simplicity, and generosity. And thank you for reconnecting us with that biblical vision of shalom, of interconnectedness, and reminding us that yes, we seek transformation, but it's actually a restoring of what God intended. It's a rebuilding and a healing of relationships. And what I love about the vision of a world rebooted is that it's very practical, it's very action focused. And thank you for the practical suggestions of changes we can make in our own lives. There's lots to explore there. And as you remind us, there's a need to, there needs to be an urgency in our response, not just because of the pandemic, but because of the climate crisis and all those interconnected inequalities and structures of injustice that are deep rooted, but we are maybe seeing more clearly at this time. And there's one other principle that I might add to your three, and I think it's woven into all that you've said, but I would just tease it out a bit more, and that's the principle of solidarity, which again is about relationships and connectedness. And as you spoke about the interconnectedness between God, people, and the natural world, I thought of places where I have seen that lived out, where people have a deep understanding of their connection with the earth and with each other. And Ruth, I know you will have seen that too in many of the communities that Tearfund works with. And I think we need to listen and learn from people whose livelihoods are very dependent on the natural world, but who do not take more than they need and who actively work to restore nature and to keep things in balance. And it's those people that we need to be in solidarity with through our lifestyle changes and our financial choices and our campaigning, because it's those people who are most at risk from climate change, from the pandemic, and it's those people who are harmed the most by the practices of companies that profit from our current economic model. And I think we're waking up to the fact that what we understand as developed economies needs to be turned upside down, because those economic models are based on unsustainable growth. And we need to find a new path that takes us closer to that biblical vision, where we're much more aware of when enough is enough and start to focus our attention on tackling inequality, making sure that everyone has enough to live fully. And I think that Ruth made the point very clearly that change needs to happen at lots of different levels, from the grassroots through to government policy. And I think all of us gathered here tonight and the churches and communities that we represent can play a part in driving that change and in nurturing the signs of hope that are already there. And one of the ways that change happens is by creating opportunities for people to talk and to learn and to ask questions, by sharing stories of a different way of living, modelled on the kind of principles that Ruth spoke about, and to start to challenge what is considered normal as we seek a new normal. And I think that can go hand in hand with actually getting on and doing the things that are in our power to do with the finances we steward. And I think that is a role our churches should be playing, holding space for those conversations, but actually then practicing what we preach. And so in the work that we're doing at ECCR and through the Money Makes Change programme, we're trying to create those spaces where people can learn and engage and talk about issues of faith and finance. And we also want to encourage people to make very practical steps with their finances to help shape a fairer world. And we want people to think seriously about generosity, but also about how we use the entirety of our resources through where we bank, through our pensions and investments, as Ruth mentioned, and through where we spend money or where we maybe choose not to spend because we don't need to spend, and how we build and how we hold businesses to account. We have lots of resources that I think can help you do that and to make some of those practical changes. But there's one resource I want to flag up to you all, which is the Money Makes Change Pledge. This is a framework and a toolkit that we've developed to help churches connect faith and money and to reflect on all the ways in which we can steward resources for the common good. And it gives lots of practical suggestions for action, from switching to an ethical bank account to exploring ethical investing, supporting social enterprises in your local community, or campaigning on economic injustice. So I hope that those who are here tonight will look at some of those Money Makes Change resources on our website and take them back to your churches to help start some of those conversations and challenge people to live out their faith in generous and just ways through those financial choices. And we look forward to supporting and sharing the stories of a growing movement of churches that are modelling a very different way of thinking and talking about money. So we have some more events coming up this week. We also have a workshop series happening next month, which runs over 3 weeks. If you want to join with others and take a look, a bit more of a closer look at some of these issues. So hopefully see some of you there. But thank you, Bruce, for all that you shared tonight.
Great, thanks so much, Rosie. Right, we're now going to move to a time of question and answers. And a number of you have been adding questions into the Q&A box, which is fantastic. We've also had some questions submitted ahead of this evening by people who signed up to the event. So we'll also try and answer some of those. Please do continue to submit your questions. As you can see, we've got rather a lot and we only have about 20 minutes. So I'm going to try and distill some down. It's very helpful that you've been voting for the questions that you want to see. So that's really fantastic. I've put us back onto gallery view so you can see all of the panelists. And I think we're going to probably kick off with the first question, which has got the most votes. It's about tax, so I'm going to direct it towards Justin and Rowan first of all, and I think it actually probably we can combine the question from Rebecca with the third question down, which I think from the anonymous attendee, which I think is sort of asking the same thing, and it's saying, if taxation is investment in the common good, as Lord Williams asserts, how then can taxpayers insist their tax money is directed to this end and not directed to more nefarious purposes? And similarly, the question from the anonymous attendee says, retaxation doesn't assume governments are responsible in how they allocate those funds. So I think that the question is asking something similar, which is, how do we make sure that governments are using the funds that we pay in tax in a responsible way? So Rowan, shall I come to you first and then we'll go to Justin?
Okay, thank you. Really important questions there. One of my heroes is a Welsh Quaker poet called Waldo Williams, no relation, who in the 1950s refused to pay a proportion of his taxes because he didn't want to support the Korean War and actually went to jail for that. And I remember in my days in the CND in the 80s, there was talk about that sort of response. It seems to me that there are two things here. The first is it's very important to have transparency, as I said, about a taxation system, so that we do know something of the proportion of where money goes. And secondly, rather obviously, we hold our governments accountable. We have the chance of pressing them on how money is used. We have the chance of scrutinizing, or we should have the chance of scrutinizing how revenue is directed. So this broadens out, doesn't it, into a wider issue about how transparent our governmental system is as a whole, what kinds of accountability we expect from those in power, and how active we are prepared to be as individuals in political parties, grassroots, political organizations, and generally the whole range of ways in which we can try to hold our governments accountable. And I'm speaking as somebody who's still actually a member of CND and still advocating about weapons of mass destruction. So yeah, I don't have a quick fix for it, but I think those are the considerations we ought to be starting with.
Thank you. Justin?
Just briefly, I mean, because I think, as Rowan has said, it is about holding or using our democratic processes to hold our government to account, but simply to add from a Christian point of view, that first century Palestine had a fundamentally corrupt system, both the Roman one and the religious leaders, and both Jesus and Paul effectively said, pay your taxes. So if the encouragement from both of them was to pay taxes to systems or leaders that were corrupt, how much more do we need to pay ours, but use the democratic processes that are available to us to try and ensure they're as well spent and effectively spent as they can be, but they will never be perfectly spent. That's the reality of all the world, I guess.
Great, thank you. the next question is one from Les Parker, and actually is one that is similar to a question that we had submitted before the session. And it asks, how do we have wealth creation that isn't based on increasing consumption? And I'll just read out of the question that we had submitted, which it reminded me of, and I think the two are linked. The question was, if many people stop consuming and are satisfied with enough, won't economic growth go into reverse and the economy crash, leading to mass unemployment, as at the moment with lockdowns and hospitality sector, for example, and lack of public provision as a result? And is this maybe not what is referred to as the paradox of thrift? So how do we sort of square the circle of what happens to wealth creation if we stop consumption? Which I think is a really interesting question. Ruth, can I come to you on this one?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question, and if there is something that has been reinforced to us over these last 9 months, is that actually the economy does matter. So the questions and the discussions and the topics that we're looking at this evening and over the week are not disparaging of the economy and are not arguing for a position of poverty in that way. And I think that's where we come down to that middle ground, that the via media, that we try to walk between those things. And we do need livelihoods, and wealth creation is something that I believe is a biblical thing. I think it's something that we're mandated for, always with the caveat that wealth creation is given to us in order to bless others and those who, for whatever reason, haven't found themselves in other situations. Just to come to the more specific question, there's an interesting piece of work that's been done around the levels of income that are needed in order to sustain what is generally considered a good life in the UK. And it's and I can't remember what the phrase is, but they look at how much money is needed for a couple with kids, or a single person, or a single parent with kids, or an elderly couple, and they've set that at certain levels. Then another group has looked at that from a sustainability perspective and asked, if we were living lives that were sustainable, then what would be the minimum income that we would need in order to live that good life? And of course, I know that's a very subjective phrase. And what they discovered is that actually the level of income needed is less, because we consume less, and where we do consume, we consume differently. And so where we're consuming less, then we might not need to earn quite so much, because we don't need so much. And so I think for me, this is a whole economic reframing that is needed, that isn't based on needing to grow all of the time. Now, there are all sorts of discussions over whether we want to go for green growth or for a decoupling from growth, or moving away from growth completely. And I'm not going to get into the different pros and cons of those various approaches. But I think that looking at it from that sustainability lens that Rowan started us off with right at the beginning helps shift our focus away from needing always to be thinking about growth.
Fantastic, thank you. Rowan, do you have any thoughts on the question?
I'll just add to that a reference again to Tim Jackson's work and his report on prosperity without growth about 9 or 10 years ago, which looks in some depth and some detail at what wealth creation might mean without an assumption of a constant spiral of growth. Point absolutely taken about not looking for an economic system that in effect pauperizes or leads to a downward spin. But there are other approaches, I think.
Yeah. Fantastic. Great. next question, I think. We've got lots to get through and only a few more minutes to do questions. I'll move on to the next highest voted one, which comes from Jeff. Rowan's talk tended to assume a level of stability in economic and social affairs. What is the Christian response in a time of economic chaos and instability?
Yes.
So I'll come to you, Rowan, for this one.
I'm not sure I was assuming that there was a stable background, but saying that we need to work for there to be one, because when we have the kind of instability we have at present, we see how very vulnerable so many bits of our society and our economy actually are. We see where the cost falls. We see who the people are who end up shouldering disproportionate burdens, that sort of thing. And it's because of that that we need so developed and so sophisticated a kind of safety net, to put it very, very crudely. So I think at times of crisis, we need all the more to say, well, what is it that will minimize the risk to people who are already at risk? The system we have so often seems to work in a way which piles the burden onto those who are already at risk, whether it's nationally or globally. Just as we all know, environmental degradation weighs most heavily on those in many ways least well equipped to cope with its effects. So I would want to argue for stability, or as much stability as we can manage, rather than assume we've got it, which would be a slightly Pollyanna-ish thing to say, as if everything were all right, really.
Great, thank you. Anybody else like to add to that? No?
I wonder if I can just bring in here again that vision of shalom that we're working towards. I've been reflecting while Rowan was talking around the extreme of destabilized states in the sorts of countries where we work in that are fragile states, where there really is total collapse for a whole variety of reasons, and the role there of peace builders. And that's something at Tearfund that we're investing into particularly. So key individuals who are peace builders and who can work to bring people together. Often the fragility there has come about because of ethnic tensions. We see that in some degree here in the UK, and then that's exacerbated to its extreme in other states. So there really is a role for us as church in peace building, socially, environmentally, economically, politically. There's that call to peace that comes on us as the body of Christ.
Thanks, Ruth. Ruth, a question I'd like to pose to you next, a question from Grace. She asks, Ruth spoke about generosity as a principle. How should generosity be practiced if you're struggling financially, maybe because of job loss, etc.?
Yeah, thank you, Grace. It's a great question. And what I love about the scriptures is that they're not legalistic. So really the only advice that we have around giving from Paul is to give according to your means and to be generous with that. So I don't think there's any rule that says you have to give this amount or that amount. We're called to give according to our means, give according to what we can afford. And as I said when I was looking at generosity, there are other ways by which we can be generous too. It doesn't only have to be restricted and limited to the financial questions. And yet it is often noticed that those who have least are often the ones who are most generous. And that, I think that's a challenge for all of us. When I was a child, my dad said to me, when I was getting my pocket money, he said to me, Ruth, start putting aside 10% of your pocket money. It's a tiny amount, but he said, if you can do that now, and get into the habit of that. When you've only got a small amount of money, then if the time comes when you have a larger amount of money, you'll still have that discipline in there and that practice to keep going. I don't think it is about how much we give. I think there is something about us giving regularly and simply giving according to the means that we can, and trusting that God will take, even if in human terms it just looks like a small amount. I think about the widow's mite, and trusting that God will use that. Not living under guilt. If we're not in a situation where we can give lots of money, that is fine. This isn't guilt. Allowing ourselves to be free, and to find other ways to be generous that move beyond the financial as well.
Fantastic, thank you. A question to all of you, I think. This was one of the questions we had submitted ahead of the session. How do I best persuade my fellow parishioners that these issues are issues for our faith? Whoever wants to go first. Justin.
Can I kick off there? I mean, this sounds very simplistic, but I actually really think this, which is just, I would say, ensure that we share the whole of Scripture. I think that because the issues that we've been talking about find their basis in the Scriptures that we know and love. And I think the problem sometimes is just that perhaps we're a bit selective, perhaps we're in a bit of a mindset of just going to certain themes. But, you know, Ruth has quoted some and others are there. So I think I'd just say, keep going back to the Scripture and you will find these messages about our attitudes to money, our attitudes to wealth, and our attitudes to the systems of power and the structures around us. They're all there. We just need to use the resources, I suppose, in that sense that God has given us.
Thanks, Justin.
I wonder too if we can help people break out of the cultural silence that surrounds this topic of faith and finance. So I think back many years ago, when I was just beginning to explore some of the many things around these issues, I really wanted help thinking through, what does it look like in my own life? How am I supposed to live? How do I actually practically live this out? And one of the things I felt was very important was accountability and being honest. There was a Joseph Rowntree survey that said, I can't remember, 90% of people think it's offensive to be asked about their finances. But actually, I don't think in God's economy that should be the case. So I got together with a couple of very good girlfriends, and we went through a period of time where we got together regularly and we laid out all our finances. And we talked about, this is how much we earn, this is what we give, this is what we put in our investments, this is what we, etc., spend on this. And we took time, nicely interrogating each other's finances and being able to say, well, you might be spending a bit too much on this, or, oh, I think you're being, you could spend more on this. And just hearing from each other, because often we don't know because we don't talk about it. So I would encourage you to find maybe one or two people who within your church who you think you might trust, and actually start yourself modeling and living this out and talking about it, and then see if it might spread a little bit further through your church. And of course, there are good resources that your church leaders can use, and sermons and all of that kind of stuff too.
And I would just add to what Ruth said about that transparency and accountability, is to actually do the same with your church finances, and actually to be very open about where you spend money, and interrogate the questions that you ask about the products that you buy and the services and the companies that you buy from, and actually do that very openly and involve people in that conversation. Think through some of the ethics around your spending. If as a church you choose to switch to a different bank account, then you talk about the reasons behind that, talk about what potentially your money was financing in your old bank account that runs counter to the values, counter to our faith. So I think there's something there in obviously in our personal finances, but also in our churches being very transparent about the financial decisions that we make. And I know that by doing that, I think that can encourage people to look a bit more closely at their own finances. I know churches that have switched to renewable energy providers and have talked about the kind of theological reasons for that. Maybe it's been part of their eco-church journey. That then encourages people within the congregation to consider that for their household as well.
Just to echo pretty much everything that's been said, I think what Ruth was saying about circles of accountability here is a very, very creative thought, which congregations might like to think about as in the first instance, as a Lent project or something like that, just to see how hard is it to talk together confidentially without pressure about these things. And the other thing I'd just like to put into the mix here is that there are quite a lot of church schools in this country, both Anglican and Roman Catholic. And I wonder how much of this gets into the curriculum and the ethos of these educational establishments in which we have such a large investment, and what can be done there.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, everyone. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up our Q&A session there. It's been nearly out of time this evening. A huge thank you to our panelists, Rowan, Ruth, Justin and Rosie, for their thoughts this evening. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that it's been a fascinating evening exploring this critical topic and the intersection of faith and finance. Before you go, we have one last poll for you, which I'm putting up for you now. So here we go. You should be able to view that on your screen now. Would you like your local church to teach more often about issues of finance and consumerism? So we'll just give you a few minutes to vote, or a few seconds to vote rather. That's great. I think most of you have voted. I'm going to share the results. So overwhelmingly yes, which is great news. And yes, so hopefully you'll be able to lead the charge within your own churches and share what you've heard this evening. So before you go, just a few closing thoughts from us. So before we end with a closing prayer, we just wanted to highlight that ECCR is a registered charity, entirely reliant on donations. All of our Money Makes Change resources are free for individuals and churches to use, and our Restoring Hope series of online events has also been put on free of charge to participants. We hope you've been inspired, blessed, or challenged by what you've heard tonight, and perhaps you might consider contributing towards the cost of putting on these events or creating these resources. A small donation from every participant really helps to go a very long way for a charity like ourselves. And there's a number of ways that you can support us if you'd like to give. They're really easy to do, and we put those on the screen now. We're also providing a link to our website in the chat box, as well as a link to Donor Box, which we're including in the chat box now, which is a really easy way to give via debit or credit card. There's options to donate £5, £10 or £20 or any other amount you like to do. It's quick and easy, and there's also an option to mark your donation as eligible for gift aid. You can also text ECCR followed by a number indicating the amount you'd like to give to the number on the screen. For example, if you text ECCR 5, you'll be donating £5. If you text ECCR 3, you'll be donating £3. If you consider making a regular monthly contribution to our work, we'd be so grateful. Our bank details are on the slide, and if you're eligible for gift aid, you can download a form from our website or contact us, and we'd be happy to send you one to complete. We can only continue this important work and host events like these if we have the resources to do so. So any contributions are gratefully received and go a very long way. Please also consider supporting us by signing up to our monthly e-newsletters and following us on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And finally, as well, we ask that you pray for us as we continue this work. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. And of course, again, to Ruth and Rowan for sharing their thoughts and expertise, and for inspiring us to think about how we can better connect our faith with our finances. So we're going to end the meeting now with a prayer, and feel free to join in at home. Thanks for joining, and goodbye for now.
So let us pray. God of love, help us to listen to what you require of us, to understand your challenge to do justice, to be moved by your call to love kindness, to see more clearly the way to walk humbly with you. Help us through prayer, conversation, and action to be better stewards of the resources entrusted to us to shape a fairer world for all. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.